We're now on chapter 7. Chapter 7. This is the transition now from the late Roman period into the early medieval period. There's going to be a major change that's taking place. We talked some about it last time with the migrations, the invasions of the Germanic peoples. We also talked about it last time. If you weren't in that class, it's on my fire. And then we talked about the development of the church. That's what I talked about on Thursday. And the persecution of the church. And so today I want to continue on in that discussion because one of the topics today is, in your text, chapter 7, is monasticism. So I thought I'd talk about that, and we'll see how long that takes. Maybe I'll start a different topic, or maybe I won't. But monasticism is a major development in Christianity in the late antiquity period. Monasticism, it comes from a Greek word which means monakos, which means alone, which of course has its roots in the word mono, which means one. Mono. Okay? So it basically means to be alone, to be one. Monasticism will develop and change over the years. It begins really as a private one person withdrawing from society. So we want to take a look at why that happened, how that developed in the church, and what influence it has on the history of the church, history of Western civilization. So when we think of a monastery, we usually think of a group of people living in a place, right? Living in a building or a group of buildings. Here, for example, I have a picture for you of St. Catherine's Monastery. I've been able to visit this monastery. It's pretty remote, as many monasteries are. But this one is. It's in the desert of the Sinai Peninsula. It'd be controlled by Egypt today. So you'd have to look at a map of the Sinai. This would be located to the south. And it's right near mountains, very mountainous here, very dry. And it's near, reportedly, the mountain where Moses climbed up to receive the 10 Commandments. Mount Sinai is right there. Sort of, you see the mountains in the background. You have to go along, climb way up. It takes several hours to climb to the top of the mountain, which I did. Normally you get there at, most people, because it gets hot, especially if you go in the summertime. I just got a report that they had shut down people going up there because they said it was too cold. Had some cold weather lately, but typically a lot of people go there in the summer, and when you go there in the summer, you arrive at midnight at the monastery. Of course, you can't get in. They're not letting you in the monastery, but that's where you walk up. You leave around midnight, and it takes you about 4 hours, roughly, to climb up to the top of the mountain, and you're going up in the dark. They have camels you can ride part of the way, and I got on the camel because I was urged to do it. I said I'd already paid, you already paid for it, so I did. Camels don't really like, I like camels, but they don't like me. And so the camel, I don't know if you've ever ridden a camel, but the camel folds up its legs, kind of collapse down, and then they're sort of that way on the ground. And then when you get on it, then they put their back legs out first. So you're like this, and then they put their front legs up, okay? And now you're riding a camel. Now, the camel didn't really like me, and when the camel figured out that it was supposed to stand up. It didn't want to. And so the camel, the camel's like right here. So the camel's got a long neck. He just turned his head, just like that, about that far away. And he went, "Ooh," and he made a very strange noise, which I interpreted. I don't speak camel, but I interpreted that the camel was not happy. And so I got off the camel. Now the guy who's running the camel, they have a camel guy, right? Guide or whatever. He's not riding it, but he's taking care of it. He wants me to get back on there because that way he makes money. If I don't ride the camel, even if it's already paid for, he's going to want a tip at the end and all that. And I said, no, he's yelling at me. So that's a whole other experience we won't discuss. So I walked the entire way. And I still got up there about the same time as everybody else. It takes about 4 hours whether you ride the camel or not. Because the camel's not going that fast. So you walk, and you zigzag up the mountains. And finally, when you get to the end, you're just going up a pretty sheer area. And the monks there have created stairs, I guess you'd call it. Although there's no handrails, and you're just kind of climbing up, and there's like all rocks all around you, and it's dark, and you're getting all the way up to the top. When you get up to the top, you find there are other people up there, amazingly. There's even a guy selling food way up there, because he can make money selling you something to drink and something to eat. And then you sit around and you wait for the sun to rise. This is what most people do. The sun comes up about 4:30, between 4:30 and 5. So by the time you make it up there, you rest a little bit, and then you watch the sun rise over the mountains on Mount Sinai. And you take pictures, and you're duly impressed. And then you start going back down. And it takes you about 4 hours to get back down. Maybe three and a half. So by the time you get back down, it's about 8 in the morning. And I remember when I came back down, there were these ladies. I could see in the distance a bus, and I saw about 4 or 5 what I would call church ladies. I don't know. If you go to church, you know what church ladies are like. Anyway, that's what I surmised, that they were church ladies on a tour. I don't know for sure. I didn't ask. But they came up to me and they said, "Oh, is this the way up the mountain?" And I said, "Well, yes, this is the way up the Mount Sinai. It's right there." Because it's about 8:30 maybe. And it's already getting very warm. It's already probably 90 degrees or so. And so the ladies then asked me about that. And I said, "Well, yeah, that's the way." I said, "Now," and they said, "Okay." So they were going to head that way. I guess they're going to go up the mountain. I said, "Now, I just came down, but," I said, "I want you to know that I left at about midnight. And it takes 3.5 to 4 hours to climb up there." So they looked shocked and disappointed. They said on the tour, one lady said, that we would get to see Mount Sinai. And I said, "Well, you can see it, but I don't think you're going to have time to climb it. Plus, it's getting pretty hot." So anyway, the ladies, I don't think they climbed up there. But I went on. I went and visited the monastery. In fact, I know the man who's the librarian. His name is Father Justin. And so I got to know him there, and he came to the United States and spoke on another school where I taught, had him there to speak. And so he is the librarian. He's an American. He's the only American monk there, and he's the librarian. So monastic, you think about it, they're alone, they're separated, but they're together. They have little rooms where they stay called a cell, and then they take some of their meals in common, and they have work to do. Well, we want to talk about how this happens. So if you get to go there, by the way, if you take a look at this, you'll notice there's no doors. They have one door now they put in there, but for many, many years there was no door. How do you get in and out, you say? They had a rope and a basket, and they would You would stand down here, they'd throw you down the basket, you get inside, and they'd pull you up. And vice versa if you wanted to leave. That was for their protection. Today there is a door, and they do have it open for a few hours in the morning to let tourists into just a few areas. In fact, they say they have the bush which Moses saw burning inside the monastery up high. I'm tall, so I could actually reach it, but most people can't. So I guess I've touched the burning bush. I don't know if that's really the burning bush. It wasn't burning when I touched it, but, in the past. Well, how does monasticism then get there? How does this happen? We take a look at the New Testament. Do we see monasticism? Well, we're going to take a look today at some of the evidence, some of the reasons for it. It means to withdraw from society. At first it was individuals, then later on being alone, but then other people who wanted to be alone sort of together, because the alone monks actually became kind of famous and other people came to be with them. There's also a form of asceticism. Ascetic. What does that mean? That means to deny yourself. Self-discipline, self-denial. I don't know why I've got two selves there. Something happened there. I don't know what happened. But anyway, self-discipline, self-denial, contemplation. In our world today, we have almost no time for contemplation. That's not even in your vocabulary, probably most people's vocabulary. Why? Because we are constantly engaged, right? The cell phones that you have in front of you, in your pockets, that you carry with you always. It's the last thing you look at night. I'm just guessing. I don't know. I'm not spying on you. But my guess is it's the last thing you look at night and the first thing you look at in the morning is your cell phone. I'm probably not too far off on that. And you probably, if you take a look at it, I don't know how many hundreds of times you would look at it in a day. Or how many minutes, how many hours you would spend looking at your phone, poking around at it, sending messages, receiving messages. In fact, there's alerts and all kinds of things that grab your attention, dings and dongs and bings and flashing to get you engaged. So I've asked you in this class not to use your cell phones during class. I'll just remind you that now. It seems to be the time. But we have very little time that we contemplate, that we are alone. Be still and know that I am God, right? We're usually interrupted by our electronics quite often. Well, that's part of the idea. They want to deny themselves and discipline themselves and have time for contemplation. What causes monasticism? Well, I think we can go back to the New Testament. Not that there's any examples of monasticism in the New Testament. I don't think so, personally, although we do see that Jesus withdraws into the desert, right, when he is tempted and fasts. John the Baptist. But, it's never really, Jesus never really says, go become a monk or be sure to live by yourself. But we do have examples in the New Testament. The New Testament often speaks about poverty. And we're not going to get into this in depth, but just to let you know, in the Gospels, Matthew 6, don't worry about what you'll eat or drink. Matthew 19, the famous encounter of the rich young ruler who comes to Jesus and says, you know what he says, right? I've followed all the laws, all my life, and now, is there anything else I need to do? And Jesus says, sell everything that you own and give it to the poor and follow me. And so he does that, right? No, he doesn't. He leaves. He leaves. Do not take silver and gold, Matthew 10. I'm just looking at Matthew. You can find other examples. How about Matthew 19, the eye of the needle? It's easier for a camel to go through an eye of the needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven. And we could debate about what that eye of the needle is, but at any rate, the idea is that it's harder for somebody who's rich, probably because they are self-sufficient or feel they are self-sufficient. Anyway, woe to the rich! There's Luke. I went to Luke, sorry. I didn't just say in Matthew. Woe to the rich, Luke 6:24. We never hear woe to the poor, I guess. The rich man and Lazarus. How about that one? By the way, the rich man's not in the good place. Lazarus is, and he calls over to him. You know the story, right? I hope you know that story. That's an encounter that Jesus talks about that says, can I have just another chance? Can you just reach out and give me a drop of water on my tongue? Silver and gold I do not have. Acts 3. Did you ever learn that little song? They probably didn't teach you that song anymore. Silver and gold have I none? No? Oh, okay. I will try to sing it for you. It's a little song they used to teach, I guess, Sunday school classes about Peter and John went to pray. They met a lame man on the way. Well, I'll leave it at that. All right. So poverty is mentioned, and of course, that's one of the conditions of being a monk, is to be poor. In fact, to not own anything is the goal. The New Testament often talks about denying or controlling your physical desires. Matthew 5, gouge out your eye. If your eye offends thee, this is King James I'm giving you, right? There's no copyright on King James, so I can use it. Gouge it out. Pluck out your eye. Well, we can debate what that exactly means, but it's saying, at least, be careful what you're looking at and that sort of thing, because what you look at is what you desire, and then what you desire becomes what you end up doing. Paul says, I beat my body daily. 1 Corinthians 9. Again, we could debate what does Paul mean there, but he subjugates, he brings his body, his desires into control every day. Romans 12, Paul calls our body a sacrifice, a living sacrifice. That's what he says. Read it. Put your body on the altar and offer it up. Those animals are dead on the altar, by the way. And they get consumed by a fire. So that's saying that our body should be a sacrifice, even though we're not dead. But we need to sacrifice ourselves. Now here's, if we're going to even get a little more radical, let's go to the radical part. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, it is good to stay unmarried. Oh, somebody's going to the Monty Python and the monks, huh? Oh, that might have been me. That might be me. That's what these guys are. Let's do that again. See. I don't have it hooked into the mic and into the things. I forgot I had that on there. That was just for fun. Here, let's see if I can hook it up to the speaker. I don't know if the speaker works. Well, you'd have to know Monty Python. I'm not going to describe for you the movie. But if you know it, you'll understand what that is. Well, anyway, if we look at monasticism, we say, how could this happen? Go live by yourself, give up all your possessions, embrace celibacy. Where's all that coming from? there are things that are in the New Testament that could be interpreted that way. And certainly, if you take a look at some of the early church fathers, as they're sometimes called, the early leaders of the church who do a lot of the writings, like Origen, Tertullian, Cyprian, and Jerome. Jerome went off and started a monastery when he got back from the East. He went to the East to translate the Bible into Latin. Remember, we said the Bible had been translated, the Old Testament, into Greek, the Septuagint. Jerome translates the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, and that becomes known as the Vulgate. Vulgate, the Vulgate. The Vulgate, then, is the official Bible of the church for centuries. Well, some came to think that what was taught in 1 Corinthians 7 was a higher calling. A higher calling to be celibate. You could look up Matthew 19:12, if you were so inclined. Long time ago, back when I was in school, there were people that would often sign, they have little verses that were sort of like their verse. I don't know why they came up with this. But like if they send somebody a note or they have a little message, and then they put usually not John 3:16, that's too easy, but something like that. And say, okay, this is sort of my verse. This is something to make you think, a thought for the day. I don't know what it was for. So I noticed people were doing that. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So sometimes I would look them up. Sometimes I didn't. So I thought, I need to have something like that. So being the kind of guy that I am, I would write a note, or whatever, and then I would put Matthew 19:12. Now, I don't know if no one ever said anything to me about it. I'll let you look it up on your own. I won't read it to you here. But nobody ever said anything. I just put Matthew 19:12. But that's where Jesus is really talking about what we're talking about here. Jesus. All right, I'll tell you some of it. It says, some men were born eunuchs. Some men were made eunuchs by men. And others became eunuchs for the kingdom of God. That's Matthew 19. That's a paraphrase. But you get the idea. Nobody ever said anything to me. I don't know if they just read it and they thought, I don't want to talk to him about that. Or they just never looked it up. Or whatever. I don't know. So I don't know why I just told you that. But I did. So that's in there. So you can have a verse from Jesus. I put that up there. You could put Matthew 19:12 up here. Some take that as urging celibacy. All right, that's enough about that. You can think about that. We're not going to solve that. But how then does this begin? That is monasticism. We don't see monasticism until we get into the 4th century. I think that's interesting. What else happens in the 4th century? The church is made legal in the 4th century. Remember last time, if you were here last time, or if you've listened to the video from last time, I talked about the persecution of the church, how the church was persecuted, and how when we get to the 4th century, the early 300s, Christianity becomes a legal religion. Religio licita instead of religio illicita. And so now it is legal to be a Christian. Up to that point, you could really prove your faith by becoming a martyr. You could prove your faith by becoming a martyr. So, if someone tells you, make a sacrifice to the emperor or you're going to die, you could say, I will never do it, and be put to death. And you can rest assured that you have shown your faithfulness, your devotion to Christ, even to the point of losing your life. Extreme, people like extreme sports. That's extreme devotion, right? Well, that's not possible after 33 or 313 AD. The Edict of Milan makes it legal. So some people have called monasticism, instead of red martyrdom, where you give up your blood, where you actually die, it's white martyrdom. You deny yourself, and you separate yourself, and you go and live off by yourself. I think it's interesting you don't really see monasticism until after Christianity is legal. Before, when it's illegal, you show your devotion just by being a Christian. And I suppose you might say anybody who's not fully committed is not even going to become a Christian because it's going to put them at jeopardy. But when Christianity becomes easy, when it's easy to be a Christian, in fact, the emperor's a Christian, so it's even preferred. Now, all of a sudden, you got all kinds of new converts to Christianity. And some people are saying, where were you people a few years ago when this was all illegal? Where were you when people were being put to death? Now, all of a sudden, you're Christian. You can hear people saying that kind of thing, right? Well, I'm going to prove myself by becoming a monk. Now, we see that monasticism develops in sort of four ways. All right? We want to try to analyze it a little bit. Number one, sometimes it just happens, just sort of like we might say regular church people, if there is such a thing, within congregations will practice asceticism more than other people in the congregation. What does that mean? Well, maybe they refrain from certain foods, or maybe they keep certain holy days more, or maybe they keep things more rigorously. Okay? I think you know what I'm talking about. I think it's still around sometimes. People kind of make you feel bad because they're so devout, and you're not. Or maybe you're the devout one making everyone else feel bad. Well, okay. Could be. All right? So, in fact, I can tell you that in some cases, it's usually the ladies that get started with this. At least the examples I read are women. They go into, I remember with Jerome started what we might call Bible studies, all right, small groups with Jerome. And in it, he begins to teach about this idea of celibacy and denial and all that sort of thing. And some of these ladies really take it to heart. And so they decide that they're going to become celibate, but they're married. You see. And so their husbands get a little upset. That's all I'm going to say about it. Their husbands get a little upset with Jerome. What are you teaching my wife in these Bible studies? So there you go. You could do it that way. You're not going somewhere else. You're not living off by yourself. You just decide, I'm going to practice some of these things. Now later, we're going to see that some people withdraw. They are sometimes called anchorites or hermit monasticism or anchorite monasticism. You see it both ways. I like hermit myself because we live in Florida and we know what a hermit crab is. And hermit crabs are in movies and anchorites are not in too many movies. Anyway, hermit monasticism actually begins in Egypt in the desert. You go out to the desert, kind of like where that monastery was I first showed you. There's not too many people out there because there's no water, or very little food. So they would go out there and, they live in a cave. You see these two guys? They're sitting, reclining next to a cave opening. This is the cave opening of the guy who started it all. His name was Anthony, St. Anthony. By the way, St. Anthony, like the rich, he really saw a parallel with the rich young ruler. In fact, reportedly, St. Anthony heard a sermon about the rich young ruler and how the rich young ruler was very wealthy And when Jesus said, sell everything and give it to the poor, the rich young ruler was sad, I think this text says. And he went away, for he was very rich. I think that's the way it ends. Something to that effect, right? I'm paraphrasing again. But Anthony was very wealthy. He came from a very wealthy family. And when he heard this, you know what he did? He was greatly convicted. He began to disrobe. He handed everything he had to others. And he said, here I am, Lord. I have nothing now. I give everything away, even my clothing. Now, somebody voluntarily gave him some clothes. Say, borrow some from me, right? But he didn't own it. He owned nothing. All right? And that's how it gets started. And so Anthony then later is made into a saint, or he is declared a saint. And he becomes so famous that other people want to come and see him. They're interested in doing what he had done. So he becomes kind of famous. He becomes a victim of his own fame. And so people go out to the desert searching for Anthony. And when they finally found him, they want to live nearby. So they go in other little caves nearby. And they want to go and bug. The guy wants to be alone. But they come over and say, hey, Anthony, tell me about, how was it again? Did you really do that? How did you come to do this? Now, what do you do with all this alone time? What do you think about? How should I do that? And I think Anthony was just like, you know what? Just let me do my own thing. But he begins to mentor, I guess, some of these. And so they come up with a routine where they would maybe have a meal every few days together, maybe once a week. They would eat together. And they would talk together occasionally. And then they would go off to their separate caves. In fact, there got to be so many of these caves, it's called a lora. A lora is a group of caves of monks. So that's then what you can see growing into or becoming a monastery, where instead of going out into the desert and living in a cave, you build a building with little cells, like little caves, where they live. They sleep. They're very small. Kind of like a dorm room, except for only one, right? Little tiny room. And they would sleep in there, have a little bed, maybe a little stool or something, maybe a little bench, and that would be it. They didn't own it. The monastery owned that. The monastery owned their clothes. They owned nothing. This comes to be called Cenobitic monasticism. Cenobitic coming from the Greek word koinos, like koinonia, which means fellowship or being together, and bios, which means life. So, common life. We live in this monastery in common, but we are separate. Okay? That's communal living. Communal living. Living apart, living separately together. Which is kind of a strange, but that's what a monastery is. All right, so this attracts people. Now, of course, eventually you're going to need rules, right? Because anytime you get a group of people together, you're going to have conflict. I'm sure here in SEU there is no conflict. But normally, when you get a group of people together, like say in the dorms, everybody just moves in the first day and everybody just gets along perfectly right away. Well, I hope so. That's what I imagine in my mind. That's what I like to think. Although I have lived in dorms, and so I kind of know what could happen. Well, anyway, I just told you the story of Anthony. So now I'm going to tell you the story of Anthony again, but I'm not going to go into much detail. But like I said, he heard the sermon about the rich young ruler, so he sold everything and gave it to the poor. He went to live alone in a cave. Now, how do we know so much about him? There was actually a biography written about him, The Life of Anthony. Now notice those dates up there for his life are true. He lived to be 105. That's not a misprint. Reportedly, he lived to be 105. So notice he begins this towards the end of the 200s, and then he lives much of his life as a monk in the 300s. Okay? So he becomes very famous. He is known as a hermit monk or an anchorite. Anchorite means to withdraw. Hermit, means to be alone. Same kind of idea. So there's Anthony, probably the most famous, well, certainly the most famous of the early monks. Saint Anthony. All right. Now, along the way, monasticism can attract, I don't know if it's the people they attract or what, but very extreme, I think we would agree, extreme practices that some of these monks have. I'm going to tell you about a guy who had some extreme practices. His name was Simon, or some people call him Simeon. Simon the Stylite, or Simon Stylites. Everybody have this one? You ready to move on? All right, let's move on. Simon Stylites. Here is a representation of him. It looks like he's sitting in a bowl. He sort of is. What you have to know is that he's on a like what we would call a stylus. Stylus is like an ink pen, a pole. It's basically a pole. He's sitting on top of a pole. He couldn't, instead of separating himself into the desert, he separated himself vertically. Vertically. He went up on top of a pole and he stayed up there for years. And there were other people who tried similar kinds of things. For example, in Syria, we seem to have this extreme monasticism. There were some people who had lived for several months buried up to their chin in the dirt. Does it mean buried alive? Of course, people would come along and give them some water and stuff. We don't want to know all the details. Well, let's just say they were there for a long time. I know where your mind's going. Just don't ask me. Whatever you're thinking is probably true. Stylite is Greek word for a pillar. So Simon Stylites means Simon the pillar, pillar Simon, Simon on the pillar. So we see now this becomes a kind of common thing where, well, I don't know how common, but I mean, it happened with more than one person that they would go up on top of a pillar and live up there. So you can see it kind of looks like a little cup. This, I guess, so when he falls asleep, he doesn't fall off. He'd sleep up there. He'd stay up there. He lived on a pillar that was 3 feet in diameter. Well, it's about like that, right? 3 feet. It's not a lot of room. 3 feet. And 60 feet high. And he lived there for 30 years. Now, he had help. He had a rope, and people would send him water up, and some food. So people isolated themselves vertically. In fact, in one account about Simon, reportedly, he would cut himself, like cut his arms, and it would start to bleed. And then flies and insects would come. And he would say, "Feast, feast upon me." The flesh. He'd offer himself a sacrifice, I guess, to the flies. Well, pretty extreme stuff. How about Pachomius? Okay, glad you asked. You might say, well, what about Pachomius? I think I heard that from the back row. Yes, Pachomius, you're right. Pachomius lived his 12 years as a hermit, but then he decides that there's so many people that want to do this, there's really not enough room to live alone in the desert, and it's hard to get the resources for a large number of, enough water and food. There's just a lot of people that want to do this. And so he's usually credited with the first one to begin Cenobitic monasticism, that is, building a monastery as we usually think of monastic life. He's really the guy that began that. Along the banks of the Nile. Pretty soon, thousands and thousands of people are joining. They have to build, make the monastery bigger, and then they have to build other monasteries. And then, guess what? The ladies want to come too. At first, it was just men. Now the ladies said, well, we want to be monks. And of course, that creates a problem, having the male monks and the female monks living together. Could lead to problems. I don't know what those might be. I think here the way we do it is we have one of the buildings is for men and one is for women, right? This is really supposedly one building, but it's kind of like two buildings, right? We're in what are we in? The west part, and the men are upstairs, right? Floors 3 and 4, something like that. On the other building over there, the women are up there, right? Floors 3 and 4. So we still have some idea of that here on this campus. We don't have co-ed dorms. Just in case anyone's listening on the YouTube, we don't have that. So he says, now the women are coming, and what are we going to do with them? Well, we got to build them their own monastery. Well, who's going to run it? Well, Pacomius says, it's not going to be me, so they have women to lead that, and they work together, but they have separate, well, you get the idea. And now here's the thing, when you start getting hundreds of people living together and sharing everything in common, that could lead to trouble. Plus, you might begin to attract people who say, you know what? I really don't want to get a job. If I join these guys, I get, what do they say? 3 hots and a cot. That's what people say about prison sometimes. 3 hots and a cot. You go to prison, you don't have to come up with any money, and they give you food 3 times a day and a place to sleep. So the idea here is that some people might be attracted to this monastic life, maybe for not the purest of reasons. Just come here, just hang out, chill, eat the food, have my own little private room. I don't have to worry about paying bills and relatives, and all that. This is kind of appeals. So what happens then is you might get some laziness creeping into the monastic thing. So Pacomius establishes a rule. That is, if you're going to live here, here are the rules. This is when you're going to pray. This is when you're going to get up. You're going to have work to do. Everybody's going to work. You're not just going to lay around all day. Okay? All right. And that's going to be one of the problems of monasticism. There's going to have to be rules, or it could quickly degenerate into just a bunch of lazy bums laying around, and there's not going to be any. Who's going to cook the food? Well, not me. Who's going to clean it up? Well, not me. I'm going to be back in my room. See you guys later. So there's going to be rules. Everybody's going to help raise the food, take care of the animals, whatever it might be, cook the food, clean it up, all that kind of stuff. Plus, the monastery is going to need certain things, so they're actually going to begin to sell items to bring in cash to get the things they can't make themselves. Now, here's a guy, Basil of Caesarea. He will expand the rule of Pacomius, and he tries to eliminate the extreme elements. Like cutting yourself and letting the flies eat on you. You might consider that an extreme element. Because it did sometimes attract, I don't like to say, I can't say crazy people, but, people who were extreme. Much more extreme than most people. Whatever you want to call that. Okay? But I'm sure around here at Lakeland there aren't any extreme people. Everybody's very normal people in Lakeland and on our campus. So I'm just giving this as an example just because you have not experienced any extreme behavior probably in your life. But these guys did. So they said, look, we got to limit that. and try to eliminate it. The other thing he began, that is Basil of Caesarea. Caesarea, by the way, is in Palestine, right? Well, today would be Israel. Moving them to the city. This is a different concept. They started out being out in the desert away from everybody. Then they began to be sort of out remotely and living together. Like that first monastery I showed you, maybe I didn't tell you, St. Catherine's Monastery has been continuously occupied by monks, continuously, since the 4th century, early 5th century. Hundreds of years monks have lived there. And they still do. By the way, where do they put all the dead monks? They've got a little building outside of the monastery. It's a building, and it's just packed full of bones. They have a little cemetery where they bury people, but then they dig them back up and they put their bones in there. We don't like to talk about it, but your body does decay. The bones survive. And then they take the bones, they stack them in there. Okay? Of course, what we do in the United States is we kind of pump people full of chemicals to keep their body from decomposing. But they don't. They just put them in the ground. And then a few years later, so they don't have just all their land being cemetery, they dig them up, reuse that spot and bury somebody again, put the bones in a charnel house, it's called. It's a bone house. It's very interesting. You look at it's kind of creepy too, I guess, but you look at there's just bones everywhere. In fact, they got one guy, I should have brought a pic. I didn't think I was going to mention this, but one guy who had been the former leader of the monastery, he's sitting on a chair right inside on the right with like his robes on, and it's just skeleton. Anyway, you can look it up. Well, anyway, they're also, so why do they move to the city? To introduce different kind of work for them. Instead of just raising food, how about human services? That is helping people who are sick, helping people who are poor, helping people who somehow are in need. The monks could actually help the people in the city, people in urban areas. If we're out in the middle of the desert, you don't get very many visitors, nobody around, so there's really nobody to help. But if you move into an urban center, now there are children, maybe orphans, or somebody who's old, elderly, who needs help. The monks could then help. So the rule, what did monks do? They would work, had different kinds of work. They would pray, they would read the Bible, and they would perform good deeds, good works that would help people. Okay, so they had a very regimented life. They'd get up very early and they would pray. Then they would go about their duty. They'd eat some breakfast and then they would do some work. And then they would pray. And so on. Now, that's all in the East. How about in the West? In Western, part of Europe, like say France, Italy. There were no anchorite monks. Why? I don't know. The speculation is it was just too cold. Going to go live in a cave in the middle of the winter. Here in Florida you could make it, but would you want to do it in Pennsylvania? New York? Minnesota? I don't think so. So the idea here is that they moved quickly into the Cenobitic, or the ones with the monastic monastery houses. They rejected the idea of idleness and extreme asceticism. And it seems that contact in the East with Athanasius and others, when pilgrims go to the East, they see it. For example, we know Jerome actually went and lived in a monastery, came back and promoted it and started a monastery. Augustine certainly favors it, and his teacher Ambrose. And then, of course, Martin of Tours. And this doesn't mean he travels around a lot. Tours, in this case, is a city in France, southern France. Martin begins the first Western monastery in 360 AD. So that's what it dates back to, 360 AD. The first monastery in the West. They kind of skipped the early monk, anchorite monk idea. This is Martin of Tours, and here is a painting of Martin, Saint Martin. Okay. All right, so then we see that it begins in the West, and it's really going to take off in the West once it begins at 360. The guy who's really going to sort of organize it is somebody you probably have heard of. Have you ever heard of Benedictine monks? Benedictine? Maybe you have. All right, it's a lot of Benedictines. They are named for a guy named Benedict. Benedict will actually really organize the monasteries in the West, and his form of organization then becomes the standard way that they are organized in the West. So he's Benedict of Nursia, and he becomes the greatest monastic leader in the West. I don't think anyone would deny that. He creates the rule of Benedict, and you might put S on that, rules, but they just call it the rule of Benedict, but it's several rules about how monks are going to live. Very regimented, becomes a model really for all the later rules. He starts a monastery in Italy at a place called Monte Cristo, which is in the southern part of Italy. And you might have heard about it if you're a history aficionado, but you might know it from World War II because it was an outpost, and when the Allied forces are moving northward, in fact, the Nazis came down and took over the top of that hill and began bombing, lobbing stuff down on it. So it had to be bombing runs on that hill, Monte Cristo. Anyway, lots of other orders besides the Benedictine order will use the rule of Benedict, and other people will use the rule of Benedict as their model. That is, they'll start with the rule of Benedict, and then they will modify it, right? We call it plagiarism, right? They went out to Google, and they Googled rules of monasticism. Benedict came up, and they copy and pasted that one into their Word file, and then maybe they tinkered around with it and added a couple new things. Well, they didn't have any of that stuff, but that's basically the idea. Benedict becomes the guide. So what I want to do now in just a screen or two is just give you a few of the rules of Benedict. That becomes really in the West the guides for monks. First rule is this. You want to become a monk, you have to be at least 18. Cannot commit to being a monk before you're 18. Why? Because it was meant to be a lifelong commitment, and it's meant to be something very serious. So they want to make sure you are serious about it, you know what you're doing, and if you're 12 or something, well, too young, they thought. So 18. If you're going to become a monk, you had to take a vow that has three parts, a threefold vow. A vow of poverty, a vow of chastity, and a vow of obedience. This is essential. This is basic. Got to be 18. Got to be willing to take that vow. That's pretty much the same vows as, say, to go to graduate school. You'll find that out later on. Poverty, yes. Obedience, yes. Chastity, well, maybe. Okay? So what does that mean? That means that you will forfeit anything that you own. You won't own anything. If you come to the monastery, you own nothing. And you can turn it all over. You should turn it all over to either the poor, or you turn it all over to the monastery and let them divvy it out. But you would come and say, here is my stuff. I'm here. Just me. And they would give you a cloak to wear. And they would give you a place to sleep. And they would give you food to eat. In turn, you're going to have to be obedient, be chaste, and of course remain poor. The other thing is a simple diet. Not meatless, but not a lot of meat. Simple food. All right? None of your Chick-fil-A stuff. None of you. Now we got the fancy pizza coming. None of that. None of those fancy bagels. What's the other thing we got coming? Pizza. Oh, hamburgers. No fancy hamburgers. None of that stuff. Just a simple diet. Vegetables, soup, bread, a little bit of meat. Usually they have meat maybe once a week. They would use chicken. They weren't vegetarians, but they just didn't serve a lot of meat. And your life is going to be highly regulated. What do I mean by that? Well, take a look at your schedule. You're going to pray. Your prayer times are 5 a.m., 7 a.m., 9 a.m., 12 noon, 3 p.m., and sunset. So you're getting up early. Most of the time in the dark, you're going to go pray at 5, and you'll pray again at 7, you'll pray again at 9, and at noon, and at 3, and at prayer. That's 6 times, right? 5, 7, 9, 12, 3, and 6. The one at sunset usually is called Vespers, by the way. Maybe you've heard that word, Vespers, evening prayer. And you will do work, manual work and intellectual work. Some people think that intellectual work is not work. It's a different kind of work, but it's work. Right? Some of my relatives are waiting for me to get a real job. When are you going to get a real job? You need to stand around and talk. Pretty much that's it. I get paid to stand around and talk, and I guess to read stuff and put grades on it. I mean, that's, what am I making? I'm not really making anything. I'm not really carrying. I'm not lifting. I'm not doing. So, it's not manual labor, but it's still labor. Trust me, I get tired. Especially I get the emails at 2 in the morning saying something didn't work. Ding, ding, ding. Of course, nothing I can do about it at that point. By the way, if some of you had troubles with the quiz, I have sent an email to the quiz people, I'm going to call them, and we'll see, make sure it doesn't happen again, see what we can do. Well, at any rate, they're going to do sometimes intellectual work. That might be copying manuscripts or other things like that. Or manual work. We got to raise our food. We got to fix things around here. We produce things. So let's take a look then at monasticism. We're looking at it on a whole, especially in the West, Western civilization. What are some of the downside? What's the downside to monasticism? Well, normally the brightest and the best join the monasteries. The guys who are the smartest, the guys who are the most with it, the most dedicated, join the monastery, right? Why is that a problem? Well, that's a problem in that it removes those good, smart, dedicated people and just takes them right out of leadership anywhere else, right? They're not going to become, not going to work in the government. They're not going to work with people in the world. They're not going to become leaders. And since they're celibate, it means they're not going to have children. So you take the smartest and most dedicated people and say, you're not having any kids. Right? So we remove you from society, which could be a negative, and then you don't have any children. And presumably, we think if somebody's smart, maybe their kids will be smart. Not always, but Right? And so that could also have a detrimental effect. It can also lead, this separation can lead to the idea of superiority. How is that? Well, for example, you're at a Christian college. There are lots of other people at other kinds of colleges. So you might think, well, if those people at those other colleges were really serious about being a Christian, they wouldn't be going to a secular college. They would be at a Christian college. They're not learning all the things that I'm learning. They're not experiencing all the growth that I'm experiencing. Too bad for them, right? So good for me, right? Superiority. We have to be careful that we don't fall into this superior attitude. But it is, and it can happen. The other thing that we see with monasteries is that it does create division, because there are a variety of monasteries that have different emphases, and foci, right? And so they're not all unified. They're not all the same monastery, just in different locations. So they're rival. And some think that, well, my monastery is better than your monastery, and here's why. Also, we see it leads to a kind of hierarchy of, superiority, and then that often then could lead to corruption. You might think, well, monastery would be the place you get away from corruption. But in fact, we see that monasteries could and did become quite corrupt, because some of them became very, very wealthy. And then what would happen is another monastery would start and say, well, we're not going to be like Monastery A. We're going to be better. We're Monastery B. And Monastery B would then attract a lot of people, grow, get wealthy, become corrupt. Then Monastery C would say, well, we're not like Monastery B. And we see a kind of cycle of corruption and then renewal. Okay, that's on the negative side. How about on the positive side? We're going to think positive to say. I think so. Monasteries often were out in the countryside where there's very little people living out there, maybe in the woods or remote areas. They would go and clear the land. It's hard work to clear the land. Right? Cut down the trees, plow the fields, raise the crops. So they created a lot of very useful farmland. So that's good. They made productive land where there wasn't any productive land. They also become places of education and training in a time increasingly where there's very little education and very little training. They become the repository of knowledge. They become the archives, if you will, the libraries. Because most other places would have eventually no books, and many people couldn't read at all except for monks. And so it was the monks that kept alive philosophy and science and religion and everything else. And they trained and educated other people how to read and how to write. Also, monasteries did quite a bit. Most monasteries did quite a bit to help poor people. Giving them food, giving them a place maybe to stay, giving them comfort when they're sick, taking in orphans. This is another thing. I think I've got it down here later. I think it's the last one I have. But they would help the poor. They sent out missionaries. A lot of the missionary work comes out of monastic life. So they were centers of knowledge, and then from there, from that monastery, they would send, maybe in groups of 2 or 3, they would send out missionaries that would go to other areas to talk about Jesus, maybe to start a new monastery or whatever. And so we see evangelism coming out from that. As we alluded to earlier, they did copy manuscripts. We take for granted today, I think, that we can get access to about anything, just on your phone. Just Google it, right? And everything will pop up there. And the main thing is just trying to figure out what not to read or what to read, because you got so many options. But in this world, everything had to be printed. They didn't even have a printing press. It had to all be written by hand. So, for example, if I had a copy, let's say the Gospel of John, I got one copy at the monastery. That's it. So how are we going to get that Gospel of John out there? I could stand up here and read off line by line, and you could sit out there and write down line by line the Gospel of John, and it would take us quite a bit of time. But when we went through that in a month or whatever it took, at the end we'd have 35 copies of the Gospel of John. Right? Now, of course, we'd have to have the materials to write it on and the ink and all that. But when we got done, then we'd have it. And then what they would do is they would actually take those Gospels of John and they would take it around to other monasteries and trade. Oh, I got several Gospel of John manuscripts. Well, we've got Mark. We've got Luke. Or you might say, well, I've got the letters of Jerome. We say, well, we've got the writings of Augustine. We trade. And then we can make copies of that. So it copies the manuscripts. It makes sure these things get out there. And then, of course, like I said, there were corruption did come in. But these monasteries did handle the reforming of their corruption themselves. And so as it became very corrupt, it became less popular, and then a new one would start and people would flock to the new one. So even there was corruption, there was also reforming of the corruption. The other thing you might think of is that monasteries became a refuge for the outcast. What do I mean? Let's say there was someone who didn't fit into society. Maybe they had trouble speaking, had trouble walking, had maybe mental problems. What's going to happen to those people? Those people, if their families could take care of them, I'm sure they would, but sometimes the families could not. And so those people sometimes, or let's say a family member has been taking care of somebody and that family member dies. Okay? Mother has a son. Son's got problems. The mother takes care of the son, but then the mother dies. What's the son going to do? No other relatives around. Often those people would be taken into the monastery. The monks would care for them, make sure they had food. Okay? The outcast, whatever they might be, could make their way to a monastery and could often find a home. Orphans. There were no orphanages, as we have today, organized orphanages, and I guess in the United States, child protective custody, where the government has intervened. Didn't have that. Then what happened? Well, it happened as family would take care. Your brother dies and leaves the children, you would take care of your niece and nephew or whatever they were, right? And if you couldn't do it, what happens? Well, often the children would be raised in the monastery. Sometimes they were orphans, truly orphans, where their parents were both dead. Sometimes the family just didn't have enough money for all the children they had. And so they would actually come and say, please, take my son. We don't have enough food to feed him. And they would take in a child, 9, 10. They would raise that child. They would educate that child. And then when that child became 18, the child could decide if they wanted to remain as a monk. They were not forced to remain as a monk, but they could. So we can see that monasticism begins outgrowth of biblical passages and ideas, and it follows this kind of pattern of separating yourself and then eventually being separate but living together in a monastic order, both men and women, that is, they would have separate places, but you had female monks, often called nuns, and you had male monks. The leader of the monastery, by the way, was called the abbot. Abbot. You've heard in the Bible the phrase Jesus says, Abba, right? What does the word Abba mean? Anybody know? Father. Abbot means father. The father of the monastery, he was the guy who was the leader of the monastery. He was the, sort of the father who looked after. And the abbess is the female equivalent. I guess the female father, the mother, I guess, of the monastery. But they didn't call her mother, they called her abbess and abbot. And they would watch over and sort of direct things for the monastery. These monasteries become a big part of the life. There's still monasteries out there today, even here in the United States. And they have made a tremendous impact, certainly on Western civilization. All right, we'll end there for today. I hope I won't see you, I guess, till after spring break, most of you. So I hope you have a good spring break. Don't forget, we have that movie tonight, 7 o'clock, in 107 Science, right behind the bones.